Well, here we are. We're getting ready for our sixth week of the study. We have one more week together before we wrap up Living Beyond, and we are deep in the life of Joseph. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story in his life, how he was in slavery, he was in bondage, but God was building in him the actual redemption, not only of the people of Egypt, but of the land of Israel. For the entire nation of Israel, God was working a rescue plan in the midst of this turmoil and this terrible circumstance in the life of Joseph. And if you're wondering why I'm looking around, today we are sitting with our group here in Columbia, Tennessee, some precious women who are doing the study. So I am taping with them. So I'll be looking at you and at them all at the same time. But we talked about in your opening page, have you ever ridden a wooden roller coaster? A wooden roller coaster has a constant jerk. If you've been to Six Flags over Georgia, there's the wooden ones, the Scream Machine, and then there's the Mind Bender and these modern steel ones. You get a nice smooth ride. But in a wooden roller coaster, there is a constant jerk that happens. No matter if you're on top of a hill, you're zooming through a curve, there's always that rumble and that jerk. And the same was true in the life of Joseph. You know, when we're reading scripture and we get the entire life of Joseph in a matter of 13 chapters of scripture, we can forget and we can overlook very easily that he was a real person and that years pass during this time. But in the life of Joseph, there is a constant rumbling of grief. And in our circumstances, when our emotions are overwhelming, when fear creeps in, we can say, but I thought I had this conquered. But there can be battles that we fight lifelong because we are wrapped in skin. We are in this flesh wrapper that we have to battle the flesh all the time. And the enemy is never going to get tired of coming back and trying to render you useless. So in Joseph, we see this constant thread of grief. And we studied that this week. We looked in Genesis chapter 41 when Joseph, God blessed him with children. He has been elevated. He's now a ruler in Egypt. He's given a wife. He oversees all of the grain collection as they prepare for those years of famine. And in Genesis chapter 41, verse 50, we read about he has two sons. And we think that's a joyous time as mothers. It's a joy when our children are born. But the names of his children are very, very telling. Because even though he has all power, he has all the wealth he could want. He has all the stature that he could want. Everything the world tells us makes us whole. Everything the world tells us makes us secure. And here he has two sons, and their names are Manasseh. And Manasseh means God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. That tells me he has not forgotten. He has not forgotten the love that he had for his father. He has realized an appreciation for his brothers that he didn't even know he had. And then he had Ephraim. And Ephraim means God has made me fruitful in the land of my grief. Because we don't forget, we don't take for granted, and we looked at it in this week's study, that Joseph, even though he personally orchestrated the salvation of the Egyptian people by collecting all this food, he ate alone. Did you get that when we looked at the dinner tables? It says when Joseph sat down with his brothers, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but I want to focus in on Joseph's grief and Joseph's loneliness and his lack of wholeness in this time in his life. When he sat down to eat lunch with his brothers, it says that Joseph sat at his own table. His brothers sat at another table. And all the Egyptians, his very servants, the people who owed their existence to him and his wisdom that God had given him, they sat at another table because Egyptians hated Hebrews and they refused to eat with them, even though he oversaw all of that for them. Joseph sat alone. I don't know what the relationship with his wife was like, but he was married to an Egyptian woman. So we can assume that intimacy was maybe not fully enjoyed throughout his marriage. He longed to be touched. He had a brokenness in him, a missing link. in his life that was constantly there. But Joseph didn't squander and lay in his pit of self-pity, because the Lord had his hand upon him, because he turned to the Lord in his struggle as he battled those longings, as he needed the love of family that he never had during that time. God met him there. And he does the same for us. And what can seem like an unmerciful situation, like we talked about with Noah a few weeks ago, this is an unmerciful situation. Joseph longed for love that he never got while living there in Egypt, while serving in Egypt, whether he was a slave or a prisoner or the most powerful man in the country. He was lonely. There was that rumble of grief. But he allowed the Lord to meet him there. He allowed the Lord to minister to him there. And sometimes letting the Lord minister to us is a very difficult thing. We just had a conversation here about busyness, that we can fill our lives with busyness so we can avoid actually dealing with some things that need to be dealt with. We can fill our life with the presence of people to avoid dealing with the ugly. But Joseph was forced. His circumstances did not allow him to have a shoulder to cry on, but placed him in a place where God had to deal with him. And he did, and caused Joseph to prosper, caused him to be able to serve with excellence. And I just want to bring out the point also that Joseph developed skills through his time as a servant in the house of Potiphar, his time as a prisoner, serving the warden. He developed the skills there that he needed to be able to be a excellent leader for the people of Egypt, to be a planner, to be able to gather together those things to provide for the people of Egypt and ultimately for his very own family that he doesn't even realize yet. His areas, his ripples that we talked about in this week's study of influence grew as he depended on more and more on God, and as he believed God, that God was faithful, that God was not going to leave him, that God was with him. The Lord was with him in his slavery. The Lord is with us in the depth of our circumstances. And we studied John 7:38. And John 7:38 says, "He who believes in me," as the scripture said, from him, from his innermost being, from the source of all life, which is our heart, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. But we have to walk in belief, just as Joseph daily, undoubtedly, had that time of being built up by the Lord and being able to step out and walk in belief. Rivers of living water, literal life, flowed forth from Joseph's life. And when we believe God, when we believe his word, that he is going to meet us in the midst of our circumstances, that he has a plan. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "I have a plan for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you." As we believe those things from us, then living water can flow from our innermost being, and it will flow to many people. And that's a wonderful promise. We saw it. Joseph, his sphere of influence began with Potiphar's house. It blessed Potiphar. He went to the prison. The prison warden was so blessed, he says he didn't have to worry about a thing. Then he went on to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh didn't have to worry about a thing, that his kingdom would not be secure through years of famine. So I have to ask, where are your rivers flowing? Are there rivers flowing? Are you walking in belief? Are you walking in the belief that God has called you through this study to live beyond? That he has a desire for you to walk in victory, for you to walk in power, for you to walk in confidence, for you to be transformed. Because he wants to heal you, but he is going to use you to bring healing, living water to the lives of other people. And we could go on that for probably days if we were sitting over a cup of coffee.